Are you ready? Ready to bring a revolution to your relationships? Ready for the experiences on your dating adventure to evolve? Ready for more passion, intimacy, connection, and love in your relationship? Ready to heal past relationship wounds? You're in the right place. I'm Alan, the love engineer, and this is the Relationship Revolutions podcast. In this series, you'll get guidance and tips from me, interviews from other relationship experts, insights from couples who already have a great relationship, and other mind-opening conversations. G'day and welcome to the latest episode of Relationship Revolutions, where this week I'm joined by my good friend Andrew Payne. And just before we hit the record button, we were having a nice little conversation, and then the thing of positive mental role models came up, and it's like, this needs to be recorded. So, Andrew, over to you, sir.
Positive male role models. Well, I think if we go back to where I see sort of the real heart of some of the issues that we face. We have a lot of disaffected men for lots of reasons. We know that across the globe, politically, men are moving to the political right, the younger men, particularly women to the left. That's not an opinion, that's just fact. That's what's happening. And we know, we hear the stories of Andrew Tate and the manosphere and men being disaffected. And we know that on the one hand, men have had the privilege for decades, centuries, millennia. And we also know that there are some quite troubling stats around men's well-being, whether you're looking at the suicide data, men's life expectancy as opposed to women's life expectancy, whether you're looking at the data around rough sleepers, the data around prisons, education, it's bad. It's particularly bad for certain groups of males, particularly working class males, which isn't just white working class males. Let's not make that mistake. Working class males in general, the outcomes are very poor. There's a whole bank of data, credible data that supports that. And so you have a large group of disaffected males. You have a bit of gender division, I would say. I think that's true. I think when we try and have discussions around, well, let's look at some of the challenges men are facing, you've got this, hang on, it's just whataboutery, and it's taking the spotlight away from women. And I've been accused of being a misogynist just by raising thoughts and concerns around boys. And so there's a narrative that's not helpful. There's some quite darker voices on the internet that are trying to take advantage of that. We're even seeing in America, it's being described as sort of Kamala Harris and Democrats, the party of women, Donald Trump, the Republicans, the party of men. And we're seeing these kind of divides. And so it's why I feel, coming back to the positive male role models, it's so important that we look, where are our male heroes that talk sense, that are about bringing genders together, that our young men can look up to, who are hugely respectful of women, hugely respectful of men, hugely positive about masculinity, and who actually, if they were running a local youth group and you had, I don't know whether you got sons or not, you'd be like, I wish my boys were part of that group around these men, because these men are good, wholesome men. So we need to find those men. They exist. There's loads of them around. And we need to raise up some of their stories. And so I'm really passionate about it. I see some stuff that just inspires me. I meet men that inspire me. Azim Khamiza was a guest on my podcast. His son was murdered in a senseless gangland killing. His son wasn't in a gang. He was just delivering pizzas to supplement his university income. And Azim forgave his son's murderer, mentored the man, did a TED talk with the grandfather of his son's murderer, and created a forgiveness project that's gone around the world. You look at the photo of him, he's not 6'7" with a rippling physique, but he is just the epitome of strength, moral character. He is just man for me through and through. When I look at some of the organizations now going into schools, we've got Progressive Masculinity that work with young boys in schools to help them forge their own thoughts on what kind of man do I want to be. But the guys going into the schools, they're not battling toxic masculinity. they're going into schools with the view that masculinity is a beautiful thing, and let's help boys find that journey out for themselves. And the one organisation that I must just put a big shout out for, Lads Need Dads, they're in Essex, founded in 2015. They journey with lads that don't have an active father at home. And they don't just journey with them for a 6-week counselling session type thing, tick box, there you go, job done, there's a nice stat. They journey with them for years, befriending them, working with them to help them create self-awareness, helping them with reading, shaving, moving on to taking them away on holidays, teaching them trades, getting them involved in the community and all kinds of stuff. They are an amazing organisation, and they use male role models who go in and work with those lads. And I would say to anybody listening to this, whether you're a dad, whether you're an uncle, whether there's no young men you can really think of, we all have a role to play in being positive male role models in our workplaces, in our communities. Ask yourself, actually, what kind of man do I want to be? What kind of men do I want to be surrounded with? Actually, if I want to create a happier society, then what does that require of me? And if I've got a life where I'm basically at home not connecting, then I need to connect myself within my community and become that role model. So I could go on, but then I'll just go on and on about the same topic. So did that answer your question, positive male role models? That's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, there's a few things that come up for me. Firstly, thinking back to when I was rebuilding my life up after my separation, divorce, and all that lovely stuff that came with it. And it's like, I've got to reinvent myself or something, because I sort of looked at where I was at, where I wanted to be. I wanted to be a great dad and a great man and everything, but what does that look like? Up until that point, one of my biggest role models as a man was my father. I still love him to bits, even though he's sadly passed. And up until that point, and that was about the point I also came across Tony Robbins and NLP and this thing called modelling. I thought, who do I want to model this new version of me on, so to speak? And then I remembered an interview with the late guitarist from Def Leppard, Steve Clark, and where he's talking about when he wanted to learn guitar, he looked at other people, all his mates, and you got one that's totally into Jimi Hendrix, so he could play all of Jimmy's songs and sounds fantastic. And another one that might be into Led Zeppelin, and another one that's into, I don't know, whatever band was out at the time, maybe Black Sabbath. Whereas what he did was takes that bit from Jimmy Page, that bit from Jimi Hendrix, that bit from Tony Iommi and various other things, and mixed them all up together and created his own style out of that. I thought, that's very interesting. I looked at the world of coaching and saw how many people had been through the Tony Robbins programs, become a coach, and they're effectively a Tony Robbins clone. And it's like, I don't want to be a clone of anyone else. I want to be me. So I looked at that guitar side of things. Okay, who are the influences that would be good for me as a man and as a father? It's like, okay, my dad's in there. I looked at the likes of some of the guys in the metal bands that I listened to, pulled them into the mix, pulled a bit of Tony Robbins into the mix, some of the famous actors like Hugh Jackman, throw that into the mix, and also looking at my past self, it's like, which parts of me do I want to keep in this? And then slowly sort of mould myself into a new version of me. And so far, I think it's working pretty well. So that's one thing that's came up. And I do have boys. I have a 14-year-old son that's my own and a 10-year-old stepson. Totally different personalities. And you sort of seeing how the difference of having a blended family works compared to what I grew up with. It's mind-blowing. But also think back to when I was a kid. So what role models did I have? Well, I went through the Cubs and the Scouts, which was okay. And a few maybe older lads and young farmers or something. And my dad, and that was about it. But there weren't any really healthy, masculine role models at that time for me. And I think that's even worse for the younger generation.
Yeah, I think it is. I think there's a lot of reasons why there's a lack of positive male role models. I think obviously the lack of an active father is a problem. Lads need dads when they journey with boys that don't have an active father. You know, the usual reasons are death, prison, or relationship breakdown, and of course, um, for many cases, family courts are a bit of a nightmare. They're not really fit for purpose, given the sheer number of cases going through the family courts every year. About 250,000 a year comes to the family courts. They're not just cut out to deal with those numbers. So I think there's a lack of male role models. It goes beyond fatherlessness, but I mean, even I think we underestimate sometimes the impact of austerity on the UK. We know that we've lost £1 billion of government youth funding since austerity kicked off. The reality of that being the loss of thousands of youth workers who would 15, 20 years ago have been excellent role models, the loss of hundreds of youth centres where there were places to go, safe places to be around good people, most, and they're qualified quality youth workers. So I think there's a few reasons why there is a lack of role models. I think to some degree after COVID, and particularly given technology, habitually we spend so much more time in online gaming, online porn, online this, online that, that we're not going out and meeting positive male role models in that natural setting where we'd be out playing, I don't know, table tennis, whatever it may be, boys brigade, Cubs, Scouts, whatever, youth clubs. And I think that's a real shame that I think austerity and COVID together have really caused damage in terms of that positive sort of social thing that where natural role modeling will take place. And so I think there's a problem. And in schools as well, of course, we've got a lack of male teachers. 35% of secondary school teachers are male, 15% primary school teachers are male, less than 4% nursery workers are male. So there are issues there in terms of governmentally that we really need to inspire more men into education. We know that boys, in terms of the boys' performance at school, where you've got positive male teachers is really important. And then again, there's data around that seems to suggest that's a really important thing. So for me, there's lots of angles to it. One thing that struck me from my own podcast, you talk about reinventing yourself. I think it can be very hard to reinvent yourself if you're stuck in a pattern of thinking and behaving, and then you don't change the circle of people that you interact with. Your environment remains exactly the same. It's very hard then to become someone different within that environment. So I'm decisive today. I really am. I'm very confident as a person. But if you just said to me, you need to become that person in your former marriage, married to someone that was violent and abusive, well, I couldn't have been. I can. When out of that, I can reinvent myself. So I think when we reinvent ourselves, I think we have to take a long, hard look at our environment and whether we need to make changes if we're serious about reinventing ourselves.
Yeah, most definitely. And for me, being in one of those unhealthy marriages is the loneliest place on the world. Or it certainly was for me, even though I'd spent 3 months working out in a desert in Australia. Being in that marriage was a lot more lonely. Because after we got married, my friends started drifting away. The hobbies I had out, whether it's playing hockey, guitar, whatever it was, they drifted away. And then all of a sudden, I've got 2 kids as well now. And it's like, well, who am I? I am almost like my interpretation of who she told me I needed to be a good man. Because we're not taught what a good man is or a good husband. It's just autopilot. But having come out of that and rebuilt things, I don't regret it. There's part of me that wishes it never happened, but luckily I've managed to avoid all the family court stuff.
Yeah, well, I'm pleased for you that you've been able to do that. I mean, I think we get stuck in some of these relationships as well as guys because I think there is a pressure to not give up,
Yeah.
to be somebody that perseveres. That's what a good man would do. A good man would be strong. He'd sacrifice his own desires for the benefit of the kids, so he'll stay and he'll try and make his marriage work. A good bloke is stoical. And I think a lot of those expectations sort of kept me rigidly. My mindset was not that actually I could leave this marriage. I don't have to be in this. My mindset was, of course, I have to be. I'm married. That's a good man stays and fights and takes it on the chin and all this kind of nonsensy stuff. And I think that's changing. Sorry, I've just kicked my own laptop stand there. I think that's changing. I think it is changing. I think there's increased awareness around men's well-being, which is great. We've seen an explosion of men's group, Men in Sheds, and his Man Club, and his Man Gang. I've had some of these groups on my podcast, really inspiring guys. The Proper Blokes Club. There was a series of walking groups of men in London. But I think men's mental health, men as victims of domestic abuse, that more of that is around now in the narrative. I mean, men get included as a footnote when it comes to domestic abuse, considering the third of victims of domestic abuse are in fact men. You know, it's not good enough where we are, but there is at least a footnote today, which there may not have been 15 or 20 years ago. So I think I'd like to think that's changing slowly.
Yeah. So how does that change quicker? Or can it change quicker?
But I think this is where, for me, you know, the whole Andrew Tate, you know, for me, so on the one hand, it's going to sound very political. The left, the message from the left of the political spectrum is that if men could just stop being toxic masculinities, stop abusing women, be allies for women instead, sort yourselves out, be less aggressive, that'd be great. The message from the right is much more, you know, take no crap. Let's wind the clock back to the 1950s. This whole diversity, equality, inclusion thing's all bonkers and it's gone too far. And we need to wind the world back a bit. And I think for me, it's trying to find that voice in the middle that brings people together so that when we're having these conversations, we're not just fighting and going round and round in circles. The fact is you can continue to work to address the inequalities that women and girls face. You can continue to tackle violence against women and girls whilst also addressing some of the inequalities that men may face, whilst also tackling violence against men and boys. And you know, both things can be, you know, they should be progressed and developed and discussed at the same time. But I think until those things can be discussed easily, then it's going to be difficult. And I think on the one hand, we've made progress in that men's stuff is being talked about a bit more, but there is a kickback. There, you know, the recent push from Tory MP Nick Fletcher for a minister for men, there was some constructive debate around that, but it hasn't progressed anymore. And yet we have a minister for women and equalities. In fact, it's such an important job that the Women's Committee for Equalities is arguing it should be a standalone job. It shouldn't just be something that an MP carries alongside their duties to their constituents. And so it's a really important role where the Minister for Women and Equalities has an overview of policies affecting women and equalities, is responsible to Parliament, reports to the Cabinet. I mean, it's a really big role. And yet there's no minister for men. There's no strategy to tackle violence against men and boys, although 60% of victims of violence in the UK are in fact men and boys. And so for me, it's about trying to have these discussions where we're not saying men could do with these things. So that's a kick in the teeth for women. Men could just do with these things, and the lives of our sons are as important as the lives of our daughters. And so I think some things are changing. That there's more awareness around men's mental health. The one change I'm seeing with big organisations, I generally serve very large organisations, is there is an increasing commitment to do more for men. They do want men to be in the diversity, equality, and inclusion discussions. They're struggling to pull men into those, Because what men are thinking is, I could do without more patriarchy bashing and being told about all my privilege. I could just. So men are a little bit switched off from that, but I think there's an increased realization that there can be a middle ground, and so that's how we move forward, by finding that middle ground, by listening, even if what the other person is saying feels kind of inconvenient, like it clashes with our view of how we thought the world was.
Yeah, because as Stephen Covey says in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective, seek first to understand, then to be understood. If you're not willing to understand the perspectives of other people or people on the other side of the fence or whatever it may be, how do we learn anything? How do we move forward from where we are? We just keep on repeating the same old game.
Yeah, I was talking to an organisational leader a couple of weeks ago, a lady, a Black Afro-Caribbean lady, about some stuff that she wants to do around men's mental health. And she was saying herself that it's about a year ago, she'd heard the men in her organisation saying they wanted a men's network. And her reaction initially was one of just real anger, because, obviously, as a Black Afro-Caribbean woman, historically being greatly oppressed, had to battle to get to where she is today in the very senior role that she now holds. And, all honour to her, fantastic woman. But rather than feel angry about it and sort of go, yeah, like, what are you talking about? She decided, no, let's just try and find out about this, because this seems preposterous to me, but I'm going to. So she went and started talking to all the men in her organisation. What? I don't understand, what. And then she realised that actually they really need a space. Why shouldn't they have a space? And she really changed her mind on the whole thing, because she took the time to go and understand them, and she changed her stance on it. That actually, of course, it's not preposterous. It's important. And she's now a huge advocate for men's communities, whereas a year ago, she thought the whole sort of suggestion was preposterous. She's made that journey because of her own initiative. She's gone to try and talk to them and understand what's going on here. And what a woman, what an example that sets, what an example she's setting there. And we need more of her. We need more of that attitude that says, but I don't understand this. So I'll go and understand. I'll go and find out with an open mind and be prepared to change. And that's what it requires. But I guess there aren't too many people, men, women in the world like her. Often we just feel cross. We then battle against this thing that seems to be a challenge to our belief system, and then we just try and fight it.
Yeah.
I mean, I do that myself with certain things.
Yeah. Yeah, I must admit, the first time I've heard about men's spaces and whatnot, I thought, well, nah, it's whatever, don't really need them. And then I went to a Whole Man Academy dinner where there was about 15, 20 of us blokes, which very enjoyable evening. Then afterwards, like, we don't have these conversations very often. So the next time I took a couple of my friends with me, and they had the same experience talking about to them afterwards. And it's like, have you noticed that the conversations we have when we're on our own, even if there's just one woman that's in the room, the conversation completely changes. It's like, wow, that's amazing. And then you suddenly realise that actually we do need those spaces.
Yeah. And the other thing for me, I mean, this isn't a podcast, we're not really focusing the conversation on online pornography, but the only groups where men have really tried to come alongside each other and support each other have been closed male groups. Men won't talk openly about their porn habits if there are women there, but in closed, trusted men's groups, that stuff can be discussed, and that is a big problem. Not discussed enough, pushed under the carpet enough, has a massively negative effect on relationships, on our ability to be intimate, massive effect on our younger generation of men. Of course, we always had porn. I'm 50, but I didn't have a lot of access to porn because I'd have had to go to W.H. Smith's to get it, which would have been very, very embarrassing. So I wouldn't have done it. Whereas today, it's just so easy. You just on your laptop, erase your search history, easy. And so I think it is a problem. I mean, when Pornhub, the world's biggest free porn channel, so they got 33 billion searches last year. There's only 8 billion people on the planet. Only half of those people have internet access. You realize that we have a problem. That's just one channel. When you understand how it affects men, when men become addicts, how it then affects their ability to be intimate, how then depraved many of their sort of fantasies will then become, and the stuff they watch become more and more extreme. But you're only going to have that talked about. The reason I reference that, in a closed men's group.
Yeah.
Men aren't going to talk about that in front of women. And so for me, men's groups are really, really important. But the reason men's group came up is that lady, that Afro-Caribbean lady, that's the attitude we need. This feels like, I feel aggrieved by this. I don't really know why. I don't understand it. So I'll go and find out and do my homework and go and understand it before I draw any conclusions. And that's what we need to really, and I'm passionate to create a generation of young men and women who are good, critical thinkers, who don't, in a really, they look at the evidence, they fact check. It's so important. They are connected to community. So important. And we know as well from research, I was looking at some research, I don't know if you've read Dan Ariely's book on misbelief, about how people come to believe the most ridiculous of things, like Trump's stolen elections and the Flat Earth Society and everything's a conspiracy. The pharmaceuticals own the world and they're trying to turn us into robots, all that kind of stuff. But what starts people along that funnel to just complete misbelief and breakdown and of all reason and reality is they become disconnected from community. They don't have positive role models. They may have hit a particularly adverse situation in their life that has hurt them and flawed them. They don't feel connected, like anyone's looking out for them. So they're then looking for a scapegoat. They're looking for some big story that just explains everything. And then they start down this funnel. And it's why it's so important that we have balanced conversations, that we're allowed to express concerns about diversity, equality, inclusion, and express reservations without fearing being cancelled.
Yeah. And I think a lot of those stories, whether it's this side, that side, doesn't matter. There's elements of truth in everything. And there's elements of a lie in everything. Even the word belief has lie in it.
Yeah. And we all get sucked in by our own side, even when we're seasoned critical thinkers. I was watching, because I'm writing up some of my own podcast episodes, and one of the guys, actually it's the guy that heads up Progressive Masculinity, was laughing at himself because he was saying about Luis Suarez, he's a Liverpool fan, racially abused, was it Patrick Evra, I think he did, bitten several players. But this guy on Progressive Masculinity was saying how defensive he is of Luis Suarez. And he's had to, because he's a Liverpool fan. And he's like, but why am I defensive of this man who's biting players? Right? Like, I'm defensive of him simply because I am a Liverpool fan. And again, it's trying to encourage our young men, particularly because this is what, we are men. And obviously it's my that's kind of my world is men's mental health, to think critically about why they believe things, why they're feeling certain things, trying to get rid of tribalism and trying to just be a bit more critical and challenging of our own thought processes. It's really, really important.
Yeah. But then at the same time, we do need some kind of a tribe. Otherwise, we're completely isolated and not connected.
Yeah. No, absolutely. But that's where I see a dynamic kind of different men's communities where voices are tolerated, but there is challenge as well. And I do see that as the way forward. I'm in a wonderful football community where we play football on a Friday. There's a group of about 40 dads. We normally get about 20 players there. It's normally 10 aside. And then we go for some beers afterwards. And we don't always chat about deep stuff, but we do sometimes. And that's fine. There's a real connection there, and it's just, I mean, one guy says it's been his lifeline. His marriage has been on the rocks. It's been a really difficult place. There's a lot of complexity, and he says that football community is his lifeline. Once a week, he knows he can come play football, have some beers, not think about what's going on. But he knows when he gets to the pub, if he does want to talk about it, we'll listen. We won't take the mick. Nobody's going to say, "Oh, don't do deep talk here." There's none of that nonsense. We embrace it and talk about it.
Yeah, it needs to be talked about.
Yeah.
So when you're going through those life-changing experiences, you've got to be able to talk about it. For all this talk of, like the Andrew Tate side says, "Oh, you got to man up and everything." Yeah, there are times where we need to man up, and there are other times when we need to express and feel those emotions, but we also need to learn which is the right time to do which one.
Yeah, and of course, men, the testosterone thing, is it social conditioning? And when men are in a bad place, you are more likely to see obvious anger and aggression as a way of how we would express that. But I think some of it comes from teaching our young people from an early age that it's okay to talk about what you're worried about, what you're scared about, what you're sad about. Talk about it in a really matter-of-fact way. I do something with my boys before bedtime, actually, where they mark themselves out of 10. If it was a 6, well, why was it not an 8? But it was a 6, not a 4. So why was it not a 4? And we try and unpack the day a little bit, the good, the bad, the ugly, just so that they get used to talking about it as a matter of a fact sort of thing. And I think that's what it requires. I think as parents and role models, we need those conversations. I think often it's easier to put our kids on an iPad. I see this at restaurants, families out for dinner, and they put the blinking kids on pads and phones. It's like, I thought you're out for dinner. Aren't you going to be sociable and chat? But I think often we can resort, it's a discipline. When I do the bedtime chats with my boys, sometimes I feel so tired, I just want to go to bed. But it's reminding myself I need to have those conversations with them. They need those conversations so that they get used to talking openly about crap stuff, and it's just normal to talk about it.
Yeah. You mentioned the T word a minute ago, testosterone, and
yes,
there's a lot of talk these days saying that testosterone is the bad boy. Testosterone is the reason men are these abusive people, and it really gets a bit of a bad rap.
It's complicated, testosterone. I think, if you look at the animal kingdom, if you go to a deer park with the kids in October or whatever, there'll be male stags grazing side by side in the field. Such magnificent animals, best of friends as well. You go back to that same deer park, sort of February, March, they're fighting each other to the death. There's blood everywhere. And you're thinking, what the hell has just happened? Well, what's happened? I know that Rudolph is technically, I think, supposed to be female, but if we call him Rudolph anyway, Rudolph has had a massive boost of testosterone because Rudolph wants all the female deers to himself and will now fight to the death. And so certainly in the animal kingdom, testosterone makes the male animal incredibly aggressive and ready to fight to the death, so that the stronger of the species is the one with the mating rights. But the research on how testosterone is expressed, processed, experienced by Homo sapiens would suggest that it's a bit more complicated than just making men far more aggression. Of course, we have a frontal cortex, we have the massive brain, hugely complex social system. And what we also know is that testosterone is massively, massively important for our physical and mental well-being. So what there is no doubt about is the lower that your levels of testosterone are, the more likely it is you'll have a heart attack. There's no doubt about that. That's not just opinion. The research is very clear. The lower your levels of testosterone, the more you won't be able to concentrate. You'll be disengaged. You'll be unfocused. You'll be depressed, lethargic, no energy. That's fact. You've got low testosterone, and I think often we think, well, if I've got low testosterone, maybe I'll have erectile dysfunction. There'll be some issues in terms of intimacy. Well, no, that's another side effect. But we often forget that in terms of our mental state will be in a much worse place with low testosterone. The other crazy thing with testosterone, I was reading this in the Institute of Urology, that although when we have prostate cancer as men, one of the ways to treat that is to lower your testosterone. If you want to avoid getting it in the first place, the higher your testosterone levels, the better. Low testosterone is a predictor of prostate. So again, it's like, wow, okay, well, testosterone is important. It's hugely important. And the bad news is the levels are dropping for men across the globe. And again, there's no doubt that it's dropping. The only argument is by how much.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that it's dropping significantly. If you look at evidence from the States, from Denmark, only question is by how much. There was a clickbaity stat which has been picked apart. The amount of testosterone that was normal for a man in his early 60s in the 1980s is now what we consider normal for a man in his 20s, which is staggering decline in a short period of time. That has been debated. Whether it's as bad as that is, I would say, unclear from the evidence, but a serious decline that we should be rightly concerned about. And we should be asking, well, why? Why is it? Can it be reversed naturally? It can. I mean, you can get testosterone replacement therapy, which is expensive. You struggle to get that off the NHS unless you really are symptomatic. But if you're concerned, well, maybe my testosterone, I've been feeling a bit lethargic recently, and you can get a finger prick test in Superdrug, about 50 quid to do. But the things to look out for: sleep deprivation is shocking for testosterone. So they've tested men in a laboratory setting. Those on 8 hours of sleep, those on 5. Those on 8 hours of sleep, their testosterone levels were 10 to 15% higher the next day than those on 5. So sleep's one thing to look at. Sugar is terrible. Testosterone. So actually really working to reduce your sugar consumption, savory breakfast, take sugar out your tea, work it down gradually. If you're on 2 sugars in your tea, go down to 1 and then go down to half, and every which way take sugar out of your diet if you're serious. Ultra processed food, really, really bad. And often we think, oh, well, I don't eat KFC. A sandwich from Boots is ultra processed food. It has ingredients on the packet that you wouldn't normally get in your cupboard. It's ultra processed. So the problem with ultra processed food is it's lacking in things like zinc, magnesium, vitamin B12, which are really important for making testosterone. You'll find those in leafy greens, whole grain stuff, unprocessed meat, not sausages or bacon or ham, but obviously unprocessed meat. Do your homework on the diet that you need that would increase your testosterone. Very easy to find information out there, but sleep deprivation, poor diet, sugar particularly are really, really bad. Lots of low-level stress doesn't help either. So the neighbours, loud music going beep, 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 and you're getting very cross about it. Someone nicking your parking space. If you haven't got ways to manage your stress, that's not helpful. And the other big thing is vitamin D, because many of us are inside. So vitamin D is linked to testosterone production as well. So if you're living in the UK, really you want to be thinking about vitamin D supplements, particularly through the winter. I take them through the year because although I eat a very healthy diet, to eat the quantity of food you need to get the vitamin D that you need, you're going to be like, you'd be eating bowls of mushrooms. They'll be coming out your ears. So you're better off with vitamin D supplements, I would say. But be aware of testosterone. It does really affects our mental well-being. Yes, it affects our ability to be intimate, erectile dysfunction, all those kind of things. Of course it does. But there's some very, very serious long-term health implications if you have low testosterone. But most of us do, because it's dropping.
Yeah. At a scary rate.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say it's dropping at a substantial rate, and the research then kind of people argue about how much it's dropping by, but it's pretty clear it's quite substantial, I would say.
Well, I think there's many things we could talk about. So I think at some point we'll have you back on again. And who knows?
Well,
maybe
it's been
deeper.
Yeah, well, been a pleasure speaking to you. It felt like a very nice, relaxed conversation. But I hope you and your listeners have found value in obviously what we've covered. I know it's been an absolute pleasure to be on your show.
So, how can anyone listening to this reach out to you, find you, learn more about you?
Easiest way. So my surname is Payne, which is spelled P-A-I-N, and my initial is A. I mean, you'd have thought my parents would have thought about that, really, but it does make me very easy to find on social media. So Andrew Payne, if you put that into Google, my stuff will come up. But to connect with me, there's two places that I would say: LinkedIn. Go find me on LinkedIn, or my website, www.andrewpayne.co.uk. Connect with me there. I'm always happy to connect, answer questions. So yeah, great to connect with anyone that wants to.
Excellent. So, final question that I ask everybody, just don't prime them for. As this podcast is called Relationship Revolutions, what is one thing that, from your perspective, would bring a revolution to the world of dating and relationships, or revolution even?
I think we don't do enough to teach our young people about the value of boundaries, about how you actually create boundaries. Like, is there a model for thinking about boundaries so that you could create them? Really doing some work with people on boundaries and equipping people and encouraging people to protect their boundaries within relationships, to communicate their boundaries early on in a sensitive way, in a helpful way. I don't think we do enough on that, and I'm passionate about boundaries. I'm passionate that girls and boys understand their own stop and enough, and what they're not going to tolerate, what they would sacrifice. That they've thought these things through, so that actually, if they do get caught in a relationship that's not healthy, maybe it's not even that it's abusive, it's just really not a healthy dynamic, they've got the strength to say, no, my boundaries, that they are, as much as I like this person, I don't go against my boundaries. My boundaries are like my lighthouse. If I lose sight of my lighthouse in choppy waters, I'm going to crash and burn. So no, and encouraging people to have that strength to respect their own boundaries. So for me, a lot of it comes down to boundaries. I think it's quite an abstract answer that I've given you. It's not like a one-off tip that you can take away. But I think we need to teach people how to create boundaries. And I see a lot of posts on LinkedIn. Oh, you got boundaries. Create boundaries. Good leaders have boundaries. It's like, yeah, but no one shares a model for how to do it. And so I think that's the missing piece when it comes to boundaries.
Beautiful. I love it. And it's an answer that nobody else has given.
Cool.
So thank you for joining me, and we will see you on here again sometime in the near future. Thank you for listening. And if you haven't already, please leave me a review on your preferred podcast platform. Click the like button and also subscribe so that you get the new episode notifications. I'm curious, what did you take away from this episode? Please share your takeaways with me. Send me an email to relationship-revolutions@theloveengineer.rocks.